On the night of December 10, 1844, a 29-year-old dentist named Horace Wells sat in the front row of a traveling entertainment show in Hartford, Connecticut, and watched a man break his leg. Not intentionally. The man, a local volunteer named Samuel Cooley, had inhaled a deep breath of a colorless gas from a bag being passed around the audience, staggered forward in a fit of chemically induced euphoria, and slammed his shin against a wooden bench hard enough that the people sitting near him heard the crack. Cooley dropped to the floor. The audience gasped. The showman running the entertainment rushed forward, certain he had just witnessed a catastrophic liability. And then something happened that nobody in that room could explain. Samuel Cooley stood up, laughing. He looked down at his leg, he touched it, he laughed again. He had no idea he was injured. When the gas wore off 20 minutes later and the pain finally arrived, the confusion on his face was visible from the back of the room. Horace Wells sat very still. He was not watching Samuel Cooley anymore. He was staring at something that nobody else in that audience had noticed. He was staring at the future of medicine. He leaned over to the man sitting next to him and said something that must have seemed, at the time, like the statement of a lunatic. He said, "A new era in tooth pulling has come." He was wrong about the teeth. He was right about everything else. What followed that moment in Hartford, Connecticut, through a sequence of accidents, stolen credit, bitter professional rivalries, public humiliations, and at least 2 deaths that might have been prevented, was the discovery that changed surgery from a procedure defined by how fast you could cut to something that actually looked like the medicine we know today. But to understand why that night mattered, you first have to understand what surgery was before it. You have to understand what it meant to be operated on when there was no such thing as pain relief. Because the answer will change how you feel about every doctor who has ever handed you a needle and said, "You'll feel a small pinch." For the first 200,000 years of human existence, surgery was performed on people who were completely, fully conscious. There was no alternative. There had never been an alternative. If you needed a limb amputated, if you needed a tumor removed, if you needed a bladder stone, a condition so agonizing that medieval physicians considered it one of the worst afflictions a human being could endure, you were held down or tied down, or if you were lucky, given enough alcohol to dull the edges slightly, and then someone began cutting. The screaming was considered simply part of the procedure. Ancient Egyptian surgical papyri from around 1600 BCE describe surgical techniques with a clinical precision that is genuinely impressive, but they make no mention of managing pain during the procedure because there was nothing to manage it with. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, describes 48 surgical cases in detail, covering wounds, fractures, dislocations, tumors. The instructions are methodical. What is missing entirely is any acknowledgement that the patient might be suffering in a way worth addressing. The Greeks tried. Hippocrates and his school experimented with various herbal preparations, mandrake root, henbane, opium derived from poppies as sedatives. Some of these worked partially, sometimes in doses that were extremely difficult to calibrate. Too little and the patient was still screaming. Too much and the patient was dead. There was no reliable middle ground. The Romans used the same toolkit. There is a Roman recipe for a surgical sedative that involves soaking a sponge in a mixture of opium, mandrake, and hemlock and holding it under the patient's nose. It probably worked occasionally. It probably killed people occasionally. Nobody had a reliable way to tell the difference in advance. Medieval Arab physicians made real advances in pharmacological anesthesia, and a scholar named Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, described the use of inhaled preparations to produce unconsciousness for surgery in his 11th century medical encyclopedia. Some historians believe these techniques were genuinely effective. But they never became standardized. They required expertise that was rare and inconsistently transmitted. And they were largely forgotten in Europe during the centuries of medical stagnation that followed the fall of Rome. By the 18th century, surgery in Europe had reached a state of grim professionalism. Surgeons were skilled. They were fast. Speed was the most prized surgical virtue because every additional second on the table was another second of unbearable agony, and surgeons competed in speed as a matter of professional pride. The legendary Scottish surgeon Robert Liston, operating I. In the 1840s, could amputate a leg at the thigh in under 30 seconds. People came to watch him operate the way people went to the theater, and his speed was considered the pinnacle of surgical art. But Liston's famous speed tells you everything you need to know about surgery before anesthesia. You did not design procedures around what was best for the patient's recovery. You designed them around how fast you could end the screaming. The consequence was that surgery was reserved for absolute emergencies. Internal operations, opening the chest or abdomen, were essentially non-existent, because no human being could survive the level of pain involved in a prolonged operation on their internal organs while conscious. Surgeons worked on limbs, on surfaces, on the outside of the body where speed was possible. The interior of the human body was, for all practical purposes, surgically inaccessible. Joseph Henry Green, a respected London surgeon writing in the 1820s, described the ideal surgical patient as one who could bear the pain with fortitude. This was not cruelty. It was the only option available. The idea that pain could be simply removed from the equation had not yet entered the imagination of medicine. That was about to change. And it was going to change not in a hospital, not in a laboratory, not through any deliberate program of medical research, but through a series of events so improbable, so tangled with ego and accident and bad timing, that if you read them as fiction you would say the plot was implausible. It starts not with surgery at all, but with a party trick. In 1772, an English chemist named Joseph Priestley, the same man who would later discover oxygen, in the same spirit of restless experimentation that made him one of the most productive scientists of his century, synthesized a gas by pouring sulfuric acid over iron filings and collecting the vapor that resulted. He called it dephlogisticated nitrous air. We call it nitrous oxide. And from the very first moment that Priestley and his colleagues inhaled it, they noticed something remarkable. It made them laugh. Not a polite scientific chuckle. Deep, helpless, involuntary laughter followed by a feeling of warmth and well-being and mild euphoria that lasted for several minutes before fading. Priestley thought this was amusing. He noted it in his records with the careful understatement of an 18th-century scientist and moved on to his next experiment. It was a young Cornish chemist named Humphrey Davy who picked up Priestley's observation and took it seriously. Davy was 20 years old when he began experimenting with nitrous oxide at the Pneumatic Institution in Bristol in 1798. A research facility set up specifically to investigate whether various gases had medical applications. He was brilliant, reckless, and completely willing to use himself as a test subject, which was either admirable scientific courage or spectacular foolishness depending on your perspective. Davy inhaled nitrous oxide in massive quantities. He took notes on what it felt like. He gave it to his friends, including the poets Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey, who were among its most enthusiastic early users, and took notes on what it felt like for them. He had everyone in the Pneumatic Institution inhaling it on a regular basis. and the descriptions in his experimental records read less like scientific literature and more like the diary of someone throwing very interesting parties. Davy wrote that nitrous oxide produced a highly pleasurable thrilling in the chest and extremities, a feeling of brilliant colors and vivid ideas, and an overwhelming sense of well-being. He called it laughing gas, a name that stuck. And then Davy wrote one sentence in his research notes that should have changed the history of medicine immediately. He wrote, "As nitrous oxide in its extensive operation appears capable of destroying physical pain, it may probably be used with advantage during surgical operations in which no great effusion of blood takes place." He wrote this in 1800. Nobody acted on it. Not Davy himself, who moved on to other work. Not the medical establishment, which was not especially interested in the observations of a young chemist at an experimental institution. Not the surgeons, who had their own professional culture and were deeply suspicious of anything that came from outside it. For the next 4 decades, nitrous oxide existed in a peculiar limbo. It was well known that it produced euphoria and eliminated pain. This was widely publicized. It was the subject of lectures and demonstrations across Britain and America, but these demonstrations were entertainment, not science. Traveling showmen like the one Horace Wells watched in Hartford would invite audience members to inhale the gas and then perform the resulting spectacle of giddiness and laughter, and stumbling for a paying crowd. The gap between this gas eliminates pain, and this gas could be used in surgery was a gap that required someone to make a connection that, in retrospect, seems obvious. But obvious in retrospect is not the same as obvious at the time. The person who finally made the connection was, officially, a Boston dentist named William Thomas Green Morton. But the real story is considerably more complicated than that, and telling it properly requires going back to Horace Wells in that Hartford audience, watching Samuel Cooley not feel his broken leg. Wells was, by all accounts, a genuinely gifted dentist, innovative, curious, and deeply bothered by the suffering that his profession necessarily inflicted on patients. Tooth extraction in the 1840s was performed without any pain relief whatsoever. Patients sat in the chair, gripped the arms, and screamed while the dentist worked. Wells had been thinking about the problem for years. When he watched Cooley not feel his injury, the connection was instantaneous. The next morning, Wells went to the showman who had been running the demonstration and asked him a question. Would he be willing to supervise an experiment? The showman, whose name was Gardner Quincy Colton, agreed. Wells wanted to inhale the gas himself and have a colleague extract one of his own teeth while he was under its influence. On December 11, 1844, one day after the entertainment show, Horace Wells sat in his own dental chair, inhaled nitrous oxide administered by Colton, and had his colleague John Riggs pull a tooth from his jaw. When he came around, Wells asked, "Did you take it out? I did not feel it so much as the prick of a pin." He spent the next several weeks repeating the experiment on patients in his practice, then doing what any ambitious scientist does when they believe they have discovered something important. He went to Boston, to the medical establishment, to demonstrate his discovery publicly. This is where the story turns painful. Wells arranged a demonstration at the Massachusetts General Hospital before an audience of medical students and faculty. The patient was a student volunteer who needed a tooth extracted. Wells administered the nitrous oxide. He then extracted the tooth. and the patient cried out. Whether the patient cried out from actual pain, meaning the gas had not worked, or whether it was an involuntary vocalization from someone who was in fact insensible, nobody was ever able to establish definitively. But the audience heard a cry and the audience reacted. Someone shouted, "Humbug." Others laughed. Wells was publicly humiliated in front of the Boston medical establishment, walked out of the hospital in what witnesses described as a state of acute distress, and returned to Hartford. He never fully recovered from it. His mental health deteriorated over the following years. He began experimenting with chloroform, became addicted to it, was arrested in New York in 1848 after an episode in which he threw acid on two women while in a chloroform-induced psychosis, and killed himself in his prison cell at the age of 33, the night before he was due to be released. He was a broken man years before he died. The irony, the savage, bitter irony, is that less than 2 years after Wells was laughed out of the Massachusetts General Hospital, the very same institution staged one of the most famous demonstrations in medical history, and the man conducting it was someone Wells had worked with closely. His name was William Morton. Morton had been a student and business partner of Wells. He had watched the nitrous oxide experiments in Hartford with great interest. After Wells's humiliation in Boston, Morton did not give up on the idea of chemical anesthesia. He simply switched gases. A chemist at Harvard named Charles Jackson, and we will come back to Jackson, because his role in this story is both significant and deeply disputed, told Morton about the anesthetic properties of sulfuric ether, a compound that had been known since the 16th century and had its own history as a recreational substance. Ether parties, called ether frolics in the American South, were fairly common social events in which guests would inhale ether from soaked sponges and spend the evening in a state of altered consciousness. The pain-killing properties of ether had been observed and noted and entirely ignored by medicine for decades. Morton experimented with ether on himself, on his dog, on dental patients. In September of 1846, he successfully extracted a tooth from a patient named Eben Frost who remained completely unconscious throughout the procedure. Then Morton did what Wells had done. He went to the Massachusetts General Hospital and asked for a public demonstration. On October 16, 1846, in the operating theater of the Massachusetts General Hospital, a room still known today as the Ether Dome, a surgeon named John Collins Warren operated on a 20-year-old printer named Edward Abbott to remove a tumor from his neck. Before the operation, Morton administered ether to Abbott through an inhaler he had designed himself. Abbott lost consciousness. The operation was performed. Abbott woke up as Warren was finishing his final sutures. Warren turned to the audience of medical students and colleagues who had packed the operating theater and said words that have been repeated in medical histories ever since. He said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." That sentence, spoken in the same building where Horace Wells had been humiliated 2 years earlier, marks the official beginning of the age of anesthesia. The news spread with a speed that was extraordinary for 1846. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the physician and poet, not his Supreme Court Justice son, wrote to Morton within weeks suggesting the name anesthesia, from the Greek for insensibility, to describe the new discovery. The word was adopted immediately. Within months, ether anesthesia was being used in surgeries across Europe and America. Robert Liston, the fastest surgeon in England, performed the first operation under ether in Britain on December 21, 1846, exactly 2 months after the Ether Dome demonstration. He amputated a leg in 28 seconds, still fast because speed was still a virtue, but now for reasons that had shifted fundamentally, and woke his patient to tell him it was done. Liston's patient, a butler named Frederick Churchill who had been in agony from a diseased thigh bone for years, is reported to have wept when he understood what had happened. Not from pain, from the knowledge that it was over and he had not felt it. But while the world was celebrating the discovery of anesthesia, the people who had actually discovered it were destroying each other. The question of who deserved credit for anesthesia became one of the most vicious priority disputes in the history of science, and it consumed everyone involved. Morton applied for and received a patent on ether anesthesia, a decision that created immediate outrage in the medical community, which considered the patenting of medical discoveries deeply unethical. The U.S. Congress debated awarding Morton a prize of $100,000 for his discovery, and then declined to do so, partly because the question of who actually deserved the prize had become hopelessly tangled. Charles Jackson, the Harvard chemist who had told Morton about ether, claimed that he was the true discoverer and Morton merely his instrument. Morton denied this furiously. Crawford Long, a physician in Georgia who had actually used ether in minor surgical procedures in 1842, 4 years before the Ether Dome demonstration, but had never published his results, emerged from rural obscurity to claim his own priority. And the advocates of Horace Wells argued, with considerable justification, that Wells had been the first person to systematically apply chemical anesthesia to dentistry, and had been publicly humiliated for it while Morton was being celebrated. All 4 men spent years, and in some cases decades, pursuing their claims. Morton died in 1868, 55 years old and nearly destitute, having spent most of his adult life in legal battles over a patent that ultimately produced almost nothing. Jackson had a mental breakdown in 1873 and spent the last 7 years of his life in an asylum. Crawford Long died in 1878, largely forgotten. Wells had already been dead for 20 years. The 4 men who gave the world anesthesia were all, in different ways, destroyed by the experience. But the world they left behind was permanently, irrevocably different. Because here is what anesthesia actually changed, and it is not simply that surgery became painless, though it did. The deeper transformation was in what surgery could become. Once pain was removed from the equation, the entire logic of surgery changed. Speed had been the supreme surgical virtue for centuries, not because fast surgery was better surgery, but because less time on the table meant less time screaming. The fastest surgeon was the best surgeon because the fastest surgeon produced the least suffering. Anesthesia inverted this completely. If the patient was unconscious, it did not matter how long the operation took. The surgeon could slow down. The surgeon could be precise rather than simply rapid. The surgeon could think about what they were doing, observe what they were encountering, make decisions in the moment rather than cutting by instinct and muscle memory. Surgery went from being a performance of athletic speed to being a science. But there was a problem, a very large, very lethal problem. People were still dying on the table, not from pain. That problem was solved. Not from the anesthetic itself in most cases. They were dying from something that had always been there, something that had always been killing surgical patients, but that nobody had yet identified as the cause. They were dying from infection. Before 1847, the death rate from major surgery was staggering. Even in the best hospitals with the most skilled surgeons, between 20 and 40% of patients who underwent major operations died, usually within days of the procedure, from what physicians called hospital fever, surgical fever, or putrid infection. Nobody knew what caused it. The accepted theory among most European physicians was that it was caused by miasma, bad air, essentially. Hospitals were built with large windows to let in fresh air. Surgeons operated in well-ventilated rooms. The idea that the infection was being transmitted by the hands and instruments of the surgeons themselves was not just unrecognized. It was, when it was first suggested, rejected with professional fury. The man who first suggested it was a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis. Semmelweis was working at the Vienna General Hospital in 1847 when he noticed something that nobody else had thought to examine carefully. The mortality rate from childbed fever in the hospital's 2 maternity wards was dramatically different. One ward, staffed by midwives, had a mortality rate of around 4%. The other ward, staffed by medical students and physicians, had a mortality rate of around 10 to 18%. The women in the physician-staffed ward were dying at 2 to 4 times the rate of the women in the midwife-staffed ward. And Semmelweis noticed one critical difference between them. The medical students and physicians came directly to the maternity ward from the autopsy room where they performed dissections. The midwives did not. In 1847, a colleague of Semmelweis named Jakob Kolečka died from a wound infection he had contracted while performing an autopsy. The post-mortem examination of Kolečka's body showed lesions identical to those found in women who had died from childbed fever. The connection struck Semmelweis like a revelation. The physicians were carrying something from the dead bodies to the living patients, something on their hands, something that killed. He introduced compulsory handwashing with chlorinated lime solution for everyone who delivered babies or performed examinations in his ward. The mortality rate from childbed fever dropped immediately and dramatically, from a peak of 18% to under 2% within months. Semmelweis had discovered, through observation alone and without any understanding of the underlying mechanism, that disease was being transmitted by contaminated hands. The medical establishment's response was to reject him. The rejection was not gentle or gradual. It was swift, professional, and personal. The leading physicians of the Vienna medical faculty dismissed his conclusions as statistically meaningless, logically unfounded, and professionally offensive. The implication that physicians were killing their patients by failing to wash their hands was seen as an intolerable attack on professional honor. Semmelweis was not quiet about his views, which did not help. As his ideas were rejected by one institution after another, his behavior became increasingly erratic and aggressive. He wrote open letters to European medical authorities calling them murderers. He became obsessed with the cause to the point of mental breakdown. In 1865, he was committed to a mental asylum in Vienna. He died there 14 days later at the age of 47 from a wound infection, possibly the same type of infection that had killed so many of his patients. Whether this was a grotesque coincidence or something darker has never been established. He died without ever seeing his ideas accepted by the medical establishment that had spent 18 years ignoring him. That acceptance came from a different direction entirely. In 1865, the same year Semmelweis died, a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Lister read a paper by Louis Pasteur establishing the germ theory of disease. Pasteur had demonstrated conclusively, through a series of elegant experiments that remain celebrated in the history of science, that microbial organisms were responsible for fermentation and putrefaction. Things did not rot spontaneously, as had been believed since Aristotle. They rotted because microorganisms made them rot. Lister made the connection that Semmelweis had made by intuition. If microorganisms caused putrefaction in food, they could cause putrefaction in wounds. If you could kill the microorganisms, you could prevent the infection. Lister began experimenting with carbolic acid phenol as a wound antiseptic in 1865. He soaked his instruments in it. He soaked his sutures in it. He sprayed it into the air of his operating theater. He dressed wounds with cloth soaked in carbolic solution. His results were extraordinary. In a paper published in The Lancet in 1867, Lister reported that his ward had gone from a post-operative mortality rate consistent with the general surgical average, around 45% for major limb amputations, to virtually zero deaths from infection over an extended period. This time, the medical establishment listened. Partly because Pasteur's germ theory gave Lister a theoretical framework that Semmelweis had lacked. Partly because Lister was a respected senior figure in British surgery rather than a junior outsider. Partly because the evidence was simply too overwhelming to dismiss. And partly one suspects because Semmelweis was dead, and the discomfort of what he had been saying could no longer be so easily deflected into attacks on the man himself. Antiseptic surgery spread across Europe and America with a speed that reflected both how devastating surgical infection had always been and how long people had been waiting for a solution to it. The combination of anesthesia and antisepsis created something that had never existed before in human history: the possibility of safe internal surgery. For the first time, a surgeon could open the abdomen, and the patient might survive. The first successful appendectomy was performed in 1887. The first successful open-heart surgery would come in 1893. Procedures that had been completely impossible, literally, structurally impossible, not just technically difficult, for the entire 200,000 years of human existence before 1846 became not just possible but routine within 50 years. The transformation of life expectancy that followed was staggering. Average life expectancy in England in 1840 was around 40 years. By 1900 it was 50. By 1950 it was 68. Surgery was not the only factor in this increase. Sanitation, nutrition, and public health measures all played crucial roles. But the ability to operate safely on internal organs, to remove tumors and repair damaged tissue and treat injuries that would previously have been fatal, was a fundamental pillar of that transformation. Every appendectomy that does not kill you is a consequence of what happened in Hartford, Connecticut, on the night of December 10, 1844. Every cesarean section that saves a mother's life is a consequence of what happened in the Ether Dome on October 16, 1846. Every patient who wakes up in a recovery room rather than dying on the table from infection is a consequence of what a Hungarian physician observed about 2 maternity wards in Vienna, and was ignored for 18 years before a Scottish surgeon read a French chemist's paper and made the same connection from a different direction. And none of it was planned. None of it came from a deliberate, organized program of research aimed at solving the problem of surgical pain and infection. It came from a showman passing a bag of gas around a Hartford audience for entertainment. It came from a dentist watching a man not feel his broken leg. It came from a young chemist in Bristol who kept detailed records of a party drug and wrote one sentence that sat unread in the medical literature for 40 years. The history of medicine is full of discoveries made not in spite of accident but because of it. The world tends to remember the names on the patents and the papers, the men who stood in lecture theaters and gave demonstrations, the ones who published and were celebrated in their lifetimes. It forgets, usually, the ones who were laughed at. It forgets Horace Wells, who made the first connection and was humiliated for it. It forgets Ignaz Semmelweis, who was right about everything and was committed to an asylum for the crime of being correct before the establishment was ready to hear it. It forgets Crawford Long, operating in rural Georgia with ether 4 years before anyone in Boston had thought to try it, whose failure to publish meant that history moved on without him. The story of modern surgery is not a story of triumphant genius marching steadily toward enlightenment. It is a story of knowledge being lost and rediscovered, of correct ideas being rejected because the person proposing them was the wrong person at the wrong moment in the wrong place, of credit flowing not to the first person to know something, but to the first person to make the establishment listen. The Ether Dome still exists. You can visit it. It looks much as it did on that October morning in 1846 when John Collins Warren turned to his audience and said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug. It is the most sacred room in the history of American medicine, a place of genuine pilgrimage for medical students and historians." What the plaques and the official histories tend not to mention is that the patient in that room, the 20-year-old printer named Edward Abbott, was operated on for a tumor that turned out to be benign. He had not needed the operation at all. The most important surgery in human history was performed on a man who did not need to be cut open. History has a sense of humor that way. The next time you are lying on an operating table, counting backwards from 10 as the anesthetic takes, hold in the seconds before the world goes soft and warm and distant, you are experiencing the direct consequence of a night at a traveling show in Hartford in 1844, when a man broke his leg and did not feel it, and a dentist in the front row understood in an instant that the world had just changed. You just do not know it yet. And neither at the time did he.